it comes from you guys. It's not from us. It's the creative community that ultimately decides where this camera is going to go.
Okay, so exciting news. I was able to wrangle the very elusive Mat Frazer from Panasonic. Feel silly saying that because he's sitting on FaceTime right there, transparency. But he agreed to sit down and kind of talk about the new update. Of course, we've mentioned that we're on 1D or an early version. I don't know exactly how to phrase it. Matt will probably correct me and punch me through the monitor, but I wanted to sit down and let him kind of talk about some of the features as well. So here is Mat Frazer, a face you should know and love, and he's also part of the Beard Club.
Yeah, I think that's the reason we chose you, Drew, was just because we have that beard simpatico thing going on right now. So, hey everybody at CRFTSHO, appreciate you guys having me on. I love this community, big fan. So thanks, Drew, for letting me come on and talk about the firmware.
Awesome. Trust me, I'm super stoked. So obviously, in the spirit of transparency, we work together on the Heirloom project, putting that through, and we'll talk about some of those challenges. But I really wanted to let him kind of speak about, I tried to do my best to put everything in summation, but you guys are way smarter than me on the channel, and so Matt can actually answer with the technical language, and he sounds like, he is a smart guy, and he sounds like a smart guy when he says it to me, so I just nod and say, yes, sir. But anyway, Matt, can you kind of just give us the rundown? Let's maybe break it into parts. Do you want to start with like All Eye first? That was the one that was super attractive to us in the initial conversation that we had.
Yeah, so I think with All Eye, I think it's important for everybody to understand what our thinking is for adding All Eye. Number one, it tends to be easier on your computer. Your computer doesn't require as much processing power to cut through all the footage. It's really just because when we're dealing with the long GOP or IPB codecs, you have frames that are real and frames that are made up from the real frames. And your computer has to go through and find the real frames and then create the fake frames from the real ones. And that's a lot of processing power. All Eye really addresses a lot of those issues. Also, on your site, you've shown in the past some panning where it has a tendency to kind of surge through the pan. And you did a lot of investigation to find the best frame rates that give you the least amount of that. All Eye should virtually address any of those issues because you're not getting the fake frames that are having to be derived from real frames. And I think people really appreciate that as well. I think one of the things we get asked a lot about is why wouldn't we do ProRes instead of our own unique version of an All Eye codec? We'd love to have the brand name on there because it would be recognizable. But the truth is that we're really comfortable and confident in our engineers' compression algorithms. They are really good at creating great looking compression codecs. And we didn't want to use a format that's 10 plus years old for our camera. So the All Eye codec really gives us, in our opinion, the best looking image with the smallest amount of data. And it should still behave like ProRes when you bring it into Premiere or if you bring it into Final Cut.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. It does. It does pretty well. We still, and you and I talked about it before, we still transcode because it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, and I enjoy the transcode process. And it transcodes so brilliantly and quickly into a ProRes wrapper. Well, I guess it's not rewrapping, but it is transcoding. So it flows into that so well and so seamlessly. We tested 444 footage. At one point, we bumped it up to, we just bumped up different resolutions and really were playing with how far we could push the footage, and we were really happy with it. So even from, I need to scale this up, it still held really well from the ProRes side. So that's the All Eye side of things, and hopefully we have the footage link should be in the description for you guys to download some and play with it. Just me and Dawson, probably Knuckle Tree. Go ahead.
Sorry, Drew. And I just want to mention a couple of other things really quick on the All Eye side.
Yeah, please. Yeah, do it.
Because everybody forgets, we have added an All Eye for 1080 as well. So for those people who want their workflow to be 1080, we're giving you an All Eye codec as well. So you'll have a 200 megabit All Eye. That'll work up to 60 frames per second. And then in 4K, you get up to 30 frames per second All Eye as well. So I just want to make sure people are aware of that. And if you're a GH4 shooter who didn't like shooting 1080i because the footage looked softer, or it had a tendency to moire more often, that was because we had to do a lot of line skipping and pixel binning to create the 1080i frame. You're not getting any of that with the GH5. The GH5 is downsampling from the 5K image it captures down to 4K or down to 1080. So there's really no penalty for shooting 1080i if that's what you want your project to be. Now, obviously, for editing and for efficiency's sake, I prefer shooting 4K because it allows me to do crops and punch-ins and stabilization in post. But for some folks, they just want a quick and dirty edit. They want to get it out quick. That 1080 all-eye is going to be great for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we fell in love with it. One of the features that we came across or that we tested and you and I talked about in length and then we did some post-conversion on, but even now shooting it in camera, that I'm really stoked about to see how we alter that workflow is the HLG. And can you kind of talk about, like, this isn't just a gimmick. This is a broadcast standard potentially coming forward. And I mean, the tech side of it is there. But can you kind of talk about how new this is? Like the idea that isn't this the first camera that's actually shooting native HDR with in the HLG format for sure? Is that accurate? Is that fair to say?
I think in a 10-bit format, you're 100% correct. I think there's a couple of Sony cameras that they recently did a firmware update to that add an HLG look, but they're 8-bit. And so let's get into the kind of the nerdy technical side of this first. When we're dealing with HLG or hybrid log gamma, it's one of the 3 known formats for HDR content. We have Dolby Vision, which uses perceptual quantization. I'll give you guys a minute to look that up, and then we'll start from there. I'm joking. It requires you to effectively do an HDR grade in post, and then you need to do an SDR grade in post for your standard dynamic range image, or apply what's called a LUT into the metadata so that when it's sent to a standard dynamic range television set, we can correct it so that you don't have like blown out crazy highlight issues when you play it on a standard dynamic range TV. HDR10 is also PQ. HDR10 is by far the most available of the formats. Every HDR TV will decode HDR10. Every Blu-ray disc has to have, any of the Ultra HD ones that have HDR, they have to have HDR10 encoding. So it's there for that. YouTube supports HDR10, as you and I have clearly discovered. It works extremely well in HDR10 as well. So it's the most ubiquitous of the formats and the most widely available. But just like Dolby Vision, you effectively have to do 2 different grades. HLG in the GH5 is a format that allows backward compatibility. So when I shoot in hybrid log gamma in the GH5, the image is already optimized for both an SDR television as well as an HDR television. So I can effectively do 1 grade, get 1 image, and it's going to look good on both television sets. So for the layman who's going to be shooting their kids' soccer games and they want to be able to upload that footage to YouTube to kind of leave that as their repository or their storage space for all those kids' soccer games, they're going to get that stuff up in hybrid log gamma. It's going to look amazing when they show it on their HDR television at home. But when they send it on to grandma and she plays it on her smartphone or tablet and she doesn't have HDR, she's still going to have a great looking image. So hybrid log gamma was really developed more as a broadcast format or a quick to market format. And you got that in the GH5 now.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, the workflow on the back end is a little tricky. It's great to see it because we've done tests. The footage that we have up, somewhere up there will be the little bloop line things. But that footage is all native, straight off the camera, right up to YouTube, no editing done. And then if you want to grade it, we're working on a tutorial and kind of a process on how you would go about it. You have to use DaVinci at this point. Premiere, as we found out, Matt and I and Jeff, through, I don't even know how many renders. Do you know how many renders we went through? Like, do you remember seeing, like, it was a lot, right?
It's got to be over 20. I'm going to guess at least 20 renders that you and I tested. I have no idea how many renders you guys did on your end or how many crash renders you guys were going.
Yeah, that was the worst part because
I don't think your viewers really understand exactly what a pain in the neck I was for you guys to operate on this project because, you know, we introduced the idea of HDR a little late in the process. I want your viewers to know the original intent of this was to be an 8K release because we're shooting in 6K or the high resolution anamorphic mode. When you put that into a render and you de-squeeze it, you're effectively 10K wide and you have more resolution vertically than what's necessary for an 8K CinemaScope presentation. So our original thought was, hey, let's go ahead and send this out 8K. And then we said, hey, let's do 8K HDR. And then we said, oh, we don't really know if YouTube's going to support 8K HDR and downsample correctly to SDR. Well, let's go ahead and change this to 4K HDR. And CRFTSHO and Jeff and Drew have been really nice about going through all this. But I'm surprised that smoke isn't coming out of his ears right now from the meltdown that he was probably going through trying to get all this stuff worked out.
Yeah. I mean, but in fairness, the challenge was awesome because for us as filmmakers, we're taking a camera that, we're taking a camera that essentially meets the range of every type of shooter, from hobbyist to semi-pro to professional, all the way up into, cinematic pro level. I guarantee we'll start seeing it show up more on shows. It may not be the primary camera, but it'll show up on shows coming forward. I guarantee it. So for us to be able to take this camera and really put it through all the range paces as we've done, the pentultimate of that is producing content that's never existed. So without you guys really championing that cause, we loved it. The challenge was, and it was brutal. I mean, one render took, so out of DaVinci is 45 minutes for 10 minutes, but those same 10 minutes was 6+ hours to rewrap and then upload to YouTube, which was about 2 hours, and then we had to wait 4 hours for YouTube to show us the HDR. So we're talking about a 12-hour day just to view a clip. So no matter how many tests we did, it was crazy. So HLG is awesome because it kind of, if you want to go straight to the channel and you've exposed everything correctly, you can go straight to YouTube with it and view it on select televisions. We know it doesn't work on the Vizio, which is what we use for HDR10, but it does work on Sony, Panasonic if it's overseas. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we're not currently selling TVs in the US, but in Canada, we sell televisions in Canada. So Panasonic TVs in Canada will work, in Europe. Sometimes we forget YouTube is a global platform. So in most other countries, you'll be able to just pull the SD card out, stick it right in the SD card slot on Panasonic, and it'll play. But it'll work on the Sonys. You and I tested that already. We tested LG. In fact, we got YouTube, and we actually got YouTube involved because they were helping us troubleshoot HLG. And we finally got it all working and everything tested out fine. So we know LG works, we know Samsung works, we know Sony works. And it appears Samsung even updated back to 2016. It also appears LG updated back to 2016. It's just kind of weird in the LGs how you do it. I'm making that more complicated than it needs to be. Point is that you've got TVs that can do it.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you, and that's great. So one of the questions that not just the CRFTSHO community, it's a split conversation, but obviously the GH5 community in a whole, a lot of them are concerned with autofocus. Can you kind of talk about the autofocus scenario? Because I'm going to be honest, I've said this multiple times, I don't actually even know how to use it. And that sounds, maybe that makes me an amateur shooter. I just don't know how to physically set up autofocus inside the GH5. Could you kind of talk about what you guys did in terms of that? Are you prepped to talk about that kind of thing?
Sure. So let's first start off with, it's not that you're an amateur, it's that you're old.
Oh my God.
We don't use autofocus. We tend to want to use manual focus. We don't trust autofocus. We don't trust things we don't know. So I can talk a bit about it. So let's get into some nitty gritty. The biggest issue we ran into, and this is going to be a very nerdy conversation, is that in the US, the 24 frame and 2398 frame codecs were focusing extremely slow. That's just a reality. It was bizarre because we weren't receiving these same complaints in a lot of European countries on the 25 frame content. And this really has more to do with the fact that some cameras can do 50 frames, some cameras in the US, we don't have a 48 frame codec. So we're able to rely on that 50 frame to help the 25 frame focus faster. So the GH5 is doing something in the background now to help it focus much quicker, more like it's doing at 48 frames a second for focus. So I can 100% confirm that 24 frame is worlds better than the GH4 was. And it's worlds better than the GH5 on the initial firmware launch. That I can confirm. It is definitely better in 24. So anybody who's doing 23976 or 24, they're going to be really happy with that. Now, I think some problems are expectations that maybe we set for people. We benchmarked the GH4 as where we wanted to improve upon. And by the time the GH5 had come out, the reality is dual pixel was becoming very popular in Canon cameras. Sony had developed a PDAF system for autofocus on their system as well. And so I think people were comparing the camera to those systems and not necessarily against the GH4. So I want to make sure people understand that, we didn't intend to mislead people. I think it just sort of happened. But we're still working to improve the autofocus even further. I know for a fact the 24 and the 23-976 are much better. I've tested that. I know that the 60 and the 30 appear to track better, but I haven't done side-by-side comparisons. I can tell you that they in my sort of testing and playing with it, it's clearly better at tracking. It's clearly more reliable. So I think that's going to be the case. It's also important to note that you and I are on relatively early versions of the firmware. They're still tweaking the firmware now. So I know that when we released test firmware to EOS HD and when we released test firmware to DP Review, we advised them that they can't talk about the AF or test it quite yet because it's still going through some final revisions. So you're going to see some additional refinements come out before the firmware is launched.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway is that I've tried to reiterate, but I'll make sure to plug it in on the front of this too. But just a quick side note is that, yeah, we are on, I guess, beta. Is that whatever? We're on an earlier version. It is the 2.0 feature set, but it is not the final set. This is not the one that the community and GH5 users are going to get their hands on. So there are probably some little challenges. I mean, we found one. We don't have to talk about the HDMI thing, but obviously we ran into one. Hopefully they will still turn that one around, but I may cut that out.
We can talk. I think we should talk about it.
Yeah, that'd be great. So one of the biggest things, we've talked about it, is when we were shooting, we originally planned, and you see all the footage. The show gun is mounted to the side on our beautiful Titan arms, and so we had it rigged up, and we were ready to do it. When we first tested the camera, the first pass we got on it of the firmware, which was an earlier version than we're even on now, and there's a later version from this. Long story short, the HDMI eventually got disabled. So when we were shooting 6K anamorphic, when you hooked up the cable, it wasn't down converting a signal, even 1080i. So what ended up happening is Jeff had to end up pulling focus off of the de-squeezed image on the GH5 flip out 3.2 inch monitor or whatever it is. So it became a real challenge for us because then suddenly it was almost like shooting film again. We didn't actually, even reviewing a take in camera, we couldn't see it until the end of the day. So I liked the process because it was scary and exciting. It was like doing dailies, like, did I expose this? Did I expose this? And our question was, is it in focus? Is it in focus? And you'll see when they finally get to see the feature, you'll see there are some shots that are soft. That is not the camera. That is purely Jeff's beard. Rebelling against his face and not wanting to pull the focus. But it was a challenge for us, and it did present a brand new challenge in shooting that we had to overcome. So yeah, could you kind of explain, because we did sink a little bit. I think all of us were like, we kind of crunched over a little bit when we finally figured out it wasn't going to work for us. Can you talk about that now?
Yeah, so I want to clarify everything first. So what we're talking about is 6K anamorphic. We're not talking about the 4K anamorphic. We're not talking about regular video shooting. The HDMI output works fine. The issue is when you use 6K anamorphic, our engineers had discovered that there were some issues if you're outputting HDMI while shooting 6K. 6K or high resolution anamorphic really consumes a lot of processing power. It's tremendously processor intensive. First off, you're reading basically the full sensor readout, and then you're encoding an image with some of the highest resolution on the planet in this camera at that point. And then you're encoding it in H.265, which Drew has already explained to all of you is taking him hours and hours to render H.265 files when he's in post-production. So that should give you some idea of the amount of processing that's going on in the GH5. We just can't output live HDMI at the same time that 6K is going on. So that's confirmed. That will not be available on the GH5. With that said, they're working to make sure that the HDMI out will work before you press the record button and after you press the record button, which your software did not do.
Oh, so I would have taken that all day.
That would have made your life a lot easier because you were taping off. You were measuring off your distances. You had markers in place. Had you just been able to double check focus on that monitor, blow it up a little bit to verify, it would have been a heck of a lot easier for you guys. There's no question about it. And so the engineers are working to do that at least.
So in terms of that, you know, one of the things about I wanted to talk about with the project, and then we can kind of close out with any other features you wanted to mention. But with the project itself, one of the discussions that we had early on that CRFTSHO wanted to do when we first started having a conversation was, I just didn't want to shoot something that didn't challenge us creatively and didn't challenge the camera, because I feel like the easy answer, the marketing answer that you did not ask for, and I want to preface this, Panasonic, literally, Matt just reinforced us and stood behind us and helped us. When we started getting weak, he would keep pushing. So I want to praise you guys publicly, like, not as a fanboy, I mean literally, I gave you an EP credit because that's what you were. You were the champion of the project, and that's a big deal, not just because we were committed to it, but you were committed as an individual, taking my phone calls and dealing with my million questions at once. Anyway, we wanted to push the camera forward, so we didn't do something easy. Can you kind of talk about what your expectations were in the beginning and kind of where we left you? And you can give critique. Like, I don't mind. I can take it, but I'd like to, could you maybe discuss what the terms were and then how we kind of screwed all those up?
All right, so I don't think anybody messed anything up, so let's be clear with that. I know you're joking, but so it's pretty simple. When we undertake a project like this, we submit bids. I know this is going to break your heart, Drew, but you're not the first person I talked to on the project. We went out, we worked with a few different filmmakers to see what their ideas would be and what their vision was. And we have some that we've already worked with and some who we had not worked with before. But I'd always had CRFTSHO kind of in the back of my mind. For those of you who are new to the channel, it's a good idea to go back and look at the work that Drew has done, because what really caught our attention was when he was doing red versus GH footage. That was what caught my attention at first, was seeing the red versus GH. And I'm like, well, these guys are skilled and they clearly know what they're doing with the camera. You know, people don't just go out and buy a red and start shooting just for fun. So, you know, it was interesting to see the process that you guys did. But then there were certain things that kind of caught my attention. Probably the first thing that really caught my attention was when I heard Jeff say color time. For those of you who don't know, color time is a very old terminology for what we call color correction today, but it was used with film, and it's not what we use for digital. And so usually I only hear that from older DPs or people who've been in the industry for a very long time, and I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. These guys clearly are doing more than just what they're doing on CRFTSHO. So as I've watched the channel grow, I'm like, this is a good avenue for us, because Drew is an advocate for the camera without our involvement anyways. He's skilled, Jeff's skilled, so why don't we reach out and just see what they want to do? So here's the ground rules. I'll lay them out for you guys. It was a 6K anamorphic shoot, or what we call high resolution anamorphic. My number one goal is it needs to be sharp. I said it's got to be so sharp that it'll cut you, because I want to make sure that we communicate that sharpness that you're getting from that 6K or that high resolution anamorphic mode. The second thing I told him was that I need it to be sharp even when there's fast action. So I had asked for a faster shutter speed or shooting off angle, because I didn't want you guys losing stuff in the blurriness of movement. So you'll see I'm fairly certain Drew shot at a 90-degree angle. I don't think we got into the particulars of which angle he shot at, but it went to a faster shutter speed when you see a fight sequence that's in it, which really helps to show you the sharpness of the image. So my goal was that I wanted it to be sharp. That's why we used the ingenue optic. It wasn't because we wanted to show off and have you guys see a $70,000 lens. The truth is that that's probably not the lens a lot of people are going to afford to be able to use on this camera. We didn't have the time to go through and do lens tests on the more affordable solutions like the Kowas, and go through and look at the ISCOs and make decisions on which one's going to give us the sharpest image. We just didn't have the time for it. Plus, I wanted him to have a zoom so that it was quicker for their workflow to be able to do things. And so the decision was made, we're just going to go for broke. We're going to spend the money on the ingenue, get the best optic that we can get them, because I know that's sharp because I've seen it. So the ultimate goal was, I want this thing to be sharp as hell, and I want people to be able to see it sharp. Other than that, we didn't really care too much about the story. We left that in Drew's capable hands to figure out the story he wanted to tell. The sites were Drew's to be able to choose. Ultimately, we just gave some very basic parameters of what we wanted the image to look like.
Which is a filmmaker's dream, and that's kind of what I'm championing, is like, you don't often come across a relationship normally in these kind of things, you know, doing a lot of advertising with a film background, but doing a lot of advertising, right, is we end up in these relationships where it's like, we need this and this and this. You guys gave us parameters. So we purposely tried to put the camera in as real world, crazy situation as we possibly could. So we shot in dark areas. We pushed it. We shot in dusty, gross areas. We framed shots very specific ways. This wasn't just, oh, this is the best way to tell the story. This has got to be a camera test on top of it. We're trying to show off something new. So we purposely framed and tested things, put colors in the space. Every single element in that frame was thought about in order of the parameters that Panasonic asked for. The rocks in the cave, for example, are where I think the sharpness just is out of control, like too much to me. It's so realistic and so clean, it's almost 3D. And then kind of going forward on that, so we broke it down. And if you're looking for the 9-degree, all of the fight stuff is a variation on degrees, but the very specific one that is a 9-degree shutter, and I think is insane, is when she smashes the glass, and that's no spoiler, but when that happens, if you're paying attention, you can see the particles of the candy glass flying through the air, the stunt glass flying through the air. I mean, it is insane how clear that content is. So we were really floored when we watched those dailies finally that it balanced.
And I think at the end of the day, what people have to understand out there is that there is a very different experience watching this content in HDR than there is watching the standard dynamic range down converts. So if you're picking the footage apart right now, looking at it in SDR, you need to really consider the fact that this was graded for HDR. And when you look at this footage in HDR, especially delivered via YouTube, you know, for those of you who trash YouTube for its image quality or the overly compressed nature or the fact that it has a tendency to band quickly, you know, all of those are valid complaints that are completely thrown out the window when you see it streamed live over YouTube in HDR. You know, their VP 9.2 codec, along with the fact it's delivering 10-bit, it's a completely different viewing experience. I can't even stress how much different the footage looks when you're able to release it as a 10-bit file over YouTube. It's a night and day difference. And I think that if you have the opportunity to see it, you know, give you an idea, my company had to provide me with monitoring tools here at the house to be able to view this stuff as we were cutting this together. And, you know, we ended up using a projector to blow it up to about 100 inches just so that I could make sure that it was hitting the focus points were at least sharp enough in certain scenes. And obviously there's certain scenes that might look softer where focus was missed, as Drew pointed out, but they're important to the story to keep the story moving. So we kept those shots in there. But by and large, once we saw the renders on YouTube, we were completely sold that the HDR is the way to go. No doubt.
We've joked about it, and we'll close with one more question. But to close this section out, we've joked about it. Once I've seen HDR, I can't go backwards now. Everything doesn't look the same anymore. Even HLG doesn't look the same. Everything, once I've gotten into that, it was the jump for me. The best way I can describe it was going from SD, skipping HD, and going straight to 4K. It was that kind of leap visually to me. And I don't know if you have an opinion on it, but...
Well, I think HDR sort of lets people realize exactly how far behind our television standards really are. You know, you get a chance when you're editing this stuff to see the dynamic range, and, you know, Jeff gets to see what's really there when you bring it into an editing bay and you're, you know, stretching the exposure to get your highlights where you want them and to bring the black levels down to where you want. You can see how much dynamic range is there, and you can see all of the gradation that's there when you're editing this stuff. And then it's just a punch to the soul when you upload this to YouTube, and it's just a banded nightmare because you've pulled it too far. You know, it's really frustrating. And so you're able to do things with HDR now that render an amazing looking image and then deliver it over YouTube, which is just crazy to me that you can do that now. And I'll tell you what, if you guys have HDR televisions out there and you're not checking out like the HDR channel that's on YouTube just to get the eye candy that's out there, you're really missing out. And if you're not watching shows on Netflix or on Amazon Prime that are delivered in HDR, you're really missing quite an experience because the stuff is just amazing. And it really shows you how far these cameras have come. And that ultimately what's holding back the image oftentimes isn't the camera you're shooting with. It's either the delivery system that's getting you the image, or it's the lack of creativity in the filmmaker. So, you know, don't hesitate to be creative and stretch what the camera is capable of, because I think you're going to find that it's a very capable camera.
All right, so closing it out, if because there's lots of other features that we've touched on, and you and I have joked about this through all our conversations. We could sit here for an hour and a half, but we both probably should work for a living. If maybe a giant group will fund us, we'll be in better shape. We'll have the Matt and Drew show where we talk cameras. What is your favorite feature? It doesn't even have to be the ones you mentioned. I mean, your favorite feature of the new V2 firmware. So for the V2 firmware, what is your absolute favorite feature? If you, I'm not asking you to pick one, but which is the one that you're like, yes, I'm so happy this is included?
It's the one I've worked the hardest to get. So D-squeeze, anamorphic D-squeeze. There's not even a close second. Once you've shot anamorphic, it becomes addictive to shooting it, and if you can't de-squeeze the content, it makes it really hard to shoot. So I'm thrilled we added a 2x anamorphic D-squeeze when you're shooting in the anamorphic mode. But then also for the 16:9 aspect ratio, for people who want to use a 133x anamorphic lens, we've added a 133x D-squeeze as well. So the fact that we've incorporated those D-squeeze functions, and I'm going to tag on to that the guide markers so that you know what your cropping is going to be, I just think it's great. And then just to tag on to the guide markers, you know, I got to give our engineers a lot of credit. We asked for 240, we asked for 239, we asked for 235, and we asked for 16:9. And then they threw a 1:1, and I'm like scratching my head going, why the heck do we need a 1:1? And then all of a sudden I'm like, Instagram. That's exactly why they did it. And I'm like, sometimes our engineers are just way smarter than we are, and they can see things better than we can. And so those 1:1 guidelines I think are just super cool to have in there.
All right, so I'll just close it up this way. I just want to say thank you again. Obviously, CRFTSHO is grateful. The community is grateful. GH5 users are super grateful. Matt, I appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you want to say in closing? And then I'll let you go back to your life. And you know, now you only have to deal with a phone call from me once every 2 months or something.
Well, you're always welcome to call, Drew. But I want to thank everybody out there for the support they've given Panasonic throughout the line of GH series, from the GH1, where we were just cutting our teeth in video, and well, not really cutting our teeth, but on the interchangeable lens side, we're really cutting our teeth in video, all the way up through the GH4, where we really got an explosion of interest, and now on the GH5. You know, I hope you all understand that, you know, we want and love the feedback we get, and we try desperately to please you by giving you as many features as we possibly can in the camera. We're not the kind of company that's going to hold stuff back. So don't hesitate to continue to critique the camera and give us additional feedback. If we think it's useful and we think it's valuable, I will fight to make sure we get those additions to the camera as we see it available. And then obviously in the future, if there's things that we're looking for down the road, we're going to continue to fight for those things and make sure that they make it in the next generation cameras as well. So it comes from you guys. It's not from us. It's the creative community that ultimately decides where this camera is going to go. And the more feedback, the better. So again, thank you guys for the support. We really appreciate it.
And there we go. So here's this. Happy birthday to you, man. Happy birthday, Badman.
How'd you know it's my birthday? Nobody knows it's my birthday.